So really quick, who am I? This talk is, I'm the co-owner of Passive Total. Essentially, like there's a lot of companies to essentially protect yourself and make sure you don't get in trouble. But Passive Total is a project that I've been working on. I'm also a security engineer at Facebook, but I do want to note that everything related to this talk was done outside of Facebook before I got there, so I don't want that to be associated. I'm 9B plus on Twitter. The main things I'm interested in are like building better security products. We spend a lot of money. It seems that people want to constantly charge, $100,000, $150,000 a year for whatever new product they have, and then once, as you're a customer, you start using this, you're like, this thing doesn't do as well as these open source products or these ones that are for free. So it seems that all I'm paying for is just some level of support. So I'm also interested in collecting and processing large data sets and rethinking and improving the Analyst workflow. And specifically, we'll shed light on that in regards to DNS analysis. So I kind of consider command and control to be the malware choke point, if you will. You can develop and come up with the most sophisticated malware, but at some point it does need to reach back home. I recognize there's some malware that may never talk back home. Maybe that's some more destructive stuff. But for most of the malware that we're going to be dealing with, there needs to be some sort of C2 channel. And because there is a C2 channel, there requires planning, funding, and maintenance on behalf of the actor for them to set that up, to keep it going, to switch it out when somebody detects it, and they have a vested interest in it not being detected. So once found, it is generally useless. The previous speaker from Dyn, they inadvertently kind of support actors in a way, not necessarily Dyn, but those sort of infrastructures, because they effectively are able to give away free domains that attackers can essentially use and change the A record to point over to whatever IP address they control. When it gets burned, they can quickly create a new subdomain, put a new A record, and life's good. But for the most part, when it comes to any sort of registered domain, it's kind of useless once it's been burned. And especially if the company itself is sinkholing the domains. So one of the other interesting points about command and control is that it exposes a little bit of human behavior. Operators sometimes act very intimately with their command and control. They'll shut it off when they're not running operations. They'll turn it back on when they want to engage with their victims. There's this data reuse where they'll use their certain email addresses, their names, certain patterns inside of just public information that they kind of repeat. They kind of go onto that. Some of the Chinese actors that I was talking to buddies last night, they love to put their name as a subdomain. So the APT1 used Ugly Gorilla in their subdomain. These guys are creatures of habit. They're just doing a job, so it's natural that they start to slip some of their characteristics into what it is that they're doing. And then there's also the fact that they favor vendors. Oftentimes we'll see some groups just prefer the same sort of VPS provider. Whether or not they have a relationship with them, it's unknown, but it's just a matter of they must feel comfortable, they must have funding there, they must have a way to use that infrastructure, and so it's very seldom that they'll make really big leaps. Whereas other groups may use a different provider for every single attack. They may cycle through a different set of infrastructure for every victim. It kind of depends on the group, but for the most part, people are complacent in the providers they go with. And in terms of command and control, it's one of the first things that most people ask for. There's the hashes or it didn't happen mentality. But as defenders, most people are interested in what's the C2 so I can just sinkhole it and be done with this. So passive, active DNS, they essentially act as historic snapshots for the internet. Trey's talk that Project Sonar and Scans.io is an amazing project, and I really hope that they can get enough traction so that they are scanning the internet every single day because it's extremely difficult to do. It's a very time consuming, it's hard to manage all that data, but it's incredibly valuable because you essentially have the ability to reach back in time and say, well, what happened on this day at this hour for this particular domain, because now it's important. So the passive DNS, if you will, kind of provides a map of a command and control history. Domain X resolved to IP Y on Z date. IP X hosted N number of domains between Y and Z dates. Malicious domain X and suspect domain Y shared the same Z IP. So what this does is it allows you to kind of pivot between the infrastructure that these malicious actors are using in order to quickly find other potential malicious infrastructure. So from an analysis perspective, it's a very low barrier to entry. You don't really have to understand the malware itself. You don't have to go know how to reverse it. You just simply interpret, is this connected, is this domain connected to this IP? Is there a shared time frame? It's very easy for most analysts to begin looking at this data and make that one-to-one correlation, but it's also very easy to screw it up. And also infer bad conclusions and thus put out bad research. The last thing, and I think the Open DNS guys kind of showed this very well, is that it's graph friendly. This data is, just very simple relationships that can be represented in a graph, and you can take advantage of all the, query patterns inside of graph databases. But also when trying to explain this to individuals or higher ups in the company, you could just say, here's a graph, look at the data, here's the idea of like what we're talking about. So this is my interpretation of most DNS analysis today. There's a number of different sources. And when I say DNS, I mean active and passive. So if you're running active DNS and you're collecting this information, or you're running a passive source through whatever sensors you have deployed, there's multiple sources. They do different styles of collection. They do different data formats. They do different data in general. Some include other things that others don't. It's often missing data. So I have this great wealth of information of domains and IPs, but I'm lacking the things that kind of help me as an analyst make a decision. The who is information, the net blocks, the had I seen it before, what are the valid subdomains, what are the countries associated with this data. So all of that data, from an analyst perspective, the way that we kind of handle that right now is you effectively have to go out and triage a bunch of sources and kind of piece together the information that you want. So as I said before, it's easy to misinterpret, and it's even more so when you're collecting from a number of different sources, because there's a potential where different companies could collect off of different time zones. They could collect in different areas. So when you're trying to like mash this data together, you could easily start to make failed judgments or wrong conclusions. And then lastly, it's heavily pasted, and this really annoys me. Oftentimes, if anybody's part of these email lists, like Crimeware, ONA, whatever research group there is, generally the flow that happens is people will say, hey, I found this command and control, and then right after that somebody follows with a blob of passive DNS information, which is it's completely useless. It should be assumed that we all have access to these things, and if we don't, we need a better way. So the current pattern is, tell me about trendmicro-update.org. We're going to have to query all the DNS sources and parse the results. We're going to have to deduplicate all of those results, the time frames, the information, whether or not there was overlap between the sources. We have to identify overlap with any existing known bad infrastructure. So have we seen this domain before? Have we seen this IP before? Have we worked with it in an incident response case? And then we need to enrich all that data. So for each one of those IP addresses and for the domains that are present, we need to collect the who is information, the SSL certs, the malware, the networks, the country. And then after all that, we need to make a determination. And number 6 is optional, but for the most part, when you're working this on a basis where customers are asking you about domains and IP addresses on a near constant basis, you generally don't have the time to document this really well, and you usually forget about it, which is horrible because you've just spent all of this time doing all of this stuff, and you're liable to lose connections you otherwise would have found later. So this is an eyesore, but in an ideal world, this is the data that I would want to have inside of a platform. I want multiple sources to be shown in one line if it's possible. I want the data to be enriched automatically. I don't want to have to think about it. If there's an enrichment piece for the data, I want it there. I want things that tell me, that simplify my life. I want the ability to auto tag things based on its behavior. If somebody told me that this IP address is a sinkhole, when I go view the domain that's resolving to that IP address, it should tell me that it's sinkholed. If it's a dynamic DNS provider, there's thousands of them. It's ridiculously hard to track them. And it's good to know because there's times when you're dealing with a DNS, like a dynamic DNS provider like chickenkiller.com, where you may think that's a legitimate domain, so you may start to actually go through the process of looking at all the IP addresses on there and wow, look, it's been active since 2006 and it's been resolving until recent day. This is amazing. It's a treasure trove of like APT. When in reality it's a dynamic DNS provider and who knows how many people have owned that. Knowing when something's been compromised or a hosting provider, having like a tool that analysts can kind of share their research, visuals that essentially aid the analyst, you kind of get the gist. There's a lot that needs to be done and it's currently not there. So that is what Passive Total kind of tries to fill. It's a hosted platform, so it's in the cloud. There is, like, one of the philosophies I have with this is that I don't necessarily view domains and IP addresses as sensitive information. I view them more as a commodity. I think it's the context itself that is the actual thing that's sensitive and people don't necessarily want to share. So we've been asked if we would provide the on-prem devices and stuff like that. I don't know if we ever necessarily would, because we believe that if you're searching for a domain, you're not really revealing anything. It's just a domain. It's the context in which you associate to that value that makes it sensitive. So what we're trying to do is encourage people to use a system like this and take the benefits from it and stop worrying about whether or not the domain you have is extremely sensitive. If it has customer information in it, I can understand, but otherwise, I don't quite get it. It simplifies the research process because it takes all of those things that were in the previous slide and kind of represents them into one view. It's freely available to users. You can register. We do try to do some level of vetting where we just ask you if you're working where you're at. We prefer that you choose a corporate email address to register. And then we have an API as well. The screenshots and the demo that I'll show in a second are actually a newer version. So it's, I guess you could call it a beta version. It's more improved. But we're definitely feedback driven. And if you tell me that you want something and you're interested in having additional analysis or additional data, we're more than happy to like try and accommodate that. So if we take the same approach or the same question that we had before is, tell me about trendmicroupdate.org, instead of going through that entire process like we would have in the previous steps of basically walking through, getting the enrichment, making the query, we can effectively just make the query, and this is the results that you would effectively be looking at. I think most of the colors translate well. This is a really busy interface. I get that. But there's a lot of information that we're trying to present here that is important for when you're doing analysis. So to the left, you have kind of a summary view of the actual domain itself. And what's interesting here is that we take, I think, 7 sources. So we have our own source. We have Farsight that we support, Kaspersky, Domain Tools, Virus Total, Mnemonic, Network Total. We have a number of different sources and people come to us and they want to integrate their data in this as well. And the beauty of this is we've made the query, and as long as you have access, whatever sources you have access to, it effectively crunches that data down so that we have single rows, and what we'll do is we'll pick the earliest first seen and the latest last seen in an effort to derive like the maximum period of time that occurred between the changes. And on the summary view, then you get an idea of like how long this domain's actually existed, been around. We can go through the process of classifying it as targeted. And in the future, as I'm pivoting around to different IP addresses, it'll show up as red. So the colors right here inside of the table represent, green's benign, red is, no malicious or been seen with malicious. You have a kind of unique count view on the side that kind of helps with, going through and figuring out where it is that you'd like to go. And then one of the cooler features, or the thing that I find interesting, is the heat map. So the heat map's similar to GitHub, where you commit your code and it kind of tracks what you do every day. What we do is we try to overlay all the sources and their time information onto every day. And for something like a domain, we're interested in whether or not the IP address that it's resolving to is routable or non-routable. And what we do is if it's flapping in between both of them, it's green. If it's just completely routable, not moving at all, we call it yellow. And if it's non-routable, it's blue. So the benefits that you get from this, anybody who knows that they've looked at any sort of targeted infrastructure where the operators are constantly shutting their C2s on and off, green is an interesting thing to look at because it means that it's likely active or there's something likely going on. And this is something that I can understand right away by looking at this. Because I know all the way to the right is the most recent time period, I know that this domain is currently resolving to a non-routable address. Like I don't have to think about it, I don't have to view the IP addresses, it's just done. And if we go and pivot off that, we see the domains that are involved. I had mentioned when Trey was talking that we pull certificate data as well. This certificate's not really fleshed out, but one of the things that we would like to do at some point is essentially make the same connection that they do in their web front end in the same way in ours. So that you could begin clicking through, here's all the SSL certificates, the domains that were associated with SSL certificates for this IP address, effectively, a passive DNS, if you will, for SSL certs, so that analysts can then pivot on that information as well. And just like a couple other small things, the equation stuff was pretty interesting. So looking at, some of these domains, like I went through and started tagging a bunch of them. I encourage anybody who's interested in this sort of stuff, who does this on a daily basis, to register or talk with me afterwards, and I'll go through approving your account. If you're interested in giving good feedback and not being a jerk, you're more than willing I'll add you to the beta once we go there, and you can check that out. Oh, and the last thing, 2.5 minutes, is subdomains. Subdomains tend to be the most interesting thing. Somebody tells me like, oh, this is a registered domain. I want to know all the valid subdomains that exist for it, and I want to know which subdomains are most important. So this is still getting worked out, but it's effectively a summarized view of all the subdomains for a particular top-level domain. And what it does is it takes the important information that an analyst would like to know up front, and it represents that in this little block, and you can scroll through the different subdomains, and these will be sorted in an efficient way. But you can click them, and then you get the passive information directly under that with things like, this is non-routable, or it's hosting infrastructure, or this is a sinkhole. Okay, so those are all the good things. Passive total solved a lot of problems, but issues still exist. Not all record types are being collected from all of these different sources. So we try to collect as many record types as we can with our source, but we can't control what other people do. So we would encourage that everybody who is starting to do this sort of stuff, that when they are deploying code, that they're trying to collect as much information as possible. Additionally, a lot of this, including our own source, is missing DNS server locations. So we see attackers that are using their own DNS servers and pushing their own zones so that they can use, google.com as their command and control. Jaime Blasco covered this in his talk. We're missing that, and I think other sources are not necessarily keeping that information as well. We need to know where you queried the DNS resolver in an effort to for the record that you're showing us. Not retaining multiple values in one record, that's just more of a aesthetic issue. And more people are going active, so it's kind of influencing passive. When the APT1 came out, we saw everybody brute forcing subdomains so much that they ended up in Farsight's passive collector. Since they had sensors, the data was going through their sensor network, domains like, this is not a real domain, please don't resolve, was now showing up as associated to APT1 infrastructure just because all of these active DNS resolutions. We'd like to kind of consolidate that down. I honestly think Sonar is the best place to do it. We're going to continue to do it until they have a more robust infrastructure. And then lastly, time skew. This annoys me. Keep this in mind. So some sources will update the last seen instead of pushing a new record. This slide is almost self-explanatory. So PassiveTotal.com registered to this IP, was resolved to this IP address, then it changed, then it resolved back to it. When it resolves back to it, you push a new record. You do not update the existing last time field. Most of the sources do that, and that's a problem, and it skews data. And that's the only thing, that's how I'm going to end this. If you have any questions, more than happy to answer.
Maybe time for one question?
Yeah.
No, we have no time for questions, apparently. Okay, let's give him a hand.
See me on the side.